Welcome everyone to an event of the American Tarot Association featuring Dr. Joshua Canzona. The American Tarot Association's mission is to build on and advance the work and thought of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and we are so grateful that you can be with us tonight. So now to introduce our presenter tonight, Dr. Canzona, I would like to introduce to you the president of the American Tarot Association, Sister Kathleen Duffy.
So thank you, Andrew. It's now my pleasure and my privilege to present this evening's guest lecturer, Dr. Joshua Canzona. Josh is not a stranger to the American Tarot Association. He has been a valuable member of our board for several years and is not only chair of our events committee, but is also a member of the editorial board of our publications committee and belongs to several ad hoc committees. Dr. Josh Canzona holds a doctorate in theological and religious studies from Georgetown University. He has taught at the Wake Forest University School of Divinity and presently serves at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, as ombudsman and university educator, committed to bringing people together across perceived distances. Josh's research and teaching focus on religious literacy, comparative theology, and the Muslim-Christian dialogue, with specialties in mysticism, religion and science, and religion and art. In his ombudsman role, he is part of a team offering workshops and individual coaching on effective communication strategies and constructive conflict management to a higher education constituency exceeding 40,000 community members. Josh has a sustained interest in the importance of honoring different ways of knowing and examining how we can positively transform and become positively transformed by complex organizations. This evening, Josh will share some insights into the way two well-known mystics from two very different eras served as prophets of hope in the calamitous times in which they lived. He will help us to understand better our own calamitous times, how to negotiate them in a new light, and how to transform each of us so we can become bearers of hope to our world. And so now please join me in welcoming Dr. Josh Canzona.
Hi, hello everybody. Thank you so much, Andrew and Kathy. You always give the kindest introductions, and I really appreciate it. And it's so nice to see everyone here tonight. What a wonderful opportunity to spend some time together and think together about two very important Christian mystics, two very important theologians. So that said, I'll go ahead and share my screen, and we'll get started. So as Kathy said, the title tonight is Daunting, Prophets of Hope in Calamitous Times. Daunting first because I call the times calamitous, and daunting also because I've written quite the tall order for myself. How are we going to talk about both Julian and Teilhard within the space of perhaps 45 minutes? We're going to do our best is how we're going to proceed. Here are some goals to help guide us. Here's what we're going to do tonight, what we'll be able to do after tonight. Briefly describe the worldview of Teilhard and Julian in historical context. Draw connections between the thought of Julian of Norwich and Teilhard, and I'll need your help. I will make some connections myself. But please be attentive, because you'll draw your own connections. You'll see things that I missed, and I hope that you do. And then finally, we'll be able to apply these insights from Julian and Teilhard to our present moment, to our own lives. So three important goals and three lenses to guide us tonight. I'll start with this idea of a calamitous time, a challenging world. Question I would ask is are we living in a moment where there's an acute need for hope? Now, some, they might contest this. They might say, look, Josh, from a global perspective, we can look at certain metrics and times are not so bad. Would rather live now than at any other time in history even. And I could see that point of view. There's others, I'll say, hey, look, we're living in a challenging moment. And they'll say to me, yeah, that's a non-controversial thesis. Of course, we're living in a challenging moment. Look around. So that's the thesis I'm running with. But notice I say challenging, not the worst ever, not insurmountable, challenging. Why? I could come up with any number of reasons. Just to point toward a few experiences happening right now. It's climate change. There's a pandemic. The economy in the United States and globally is struggling. I'm not quite sure what's happening. I wish I knew, because then I'd be wealthy. And then division, unprecedented perhaps in America, at least going back to the Civil War, division, and certainly the image is from January 6th. And thinking about this, I also wanted to just draw some quotations, some anecdotes. So what I did is I went to an online forum, a message board. It's called Reddit. Some of you may be familiar, some not. But it's a space where all kinds of people talk about all kinds of things. However, I would note it tends to skew young and male and individuals more in the tech industry, at least historically. Maybe those demographics are shifting. So I pulled just some quotations that I thought capture the sense of a lot of conversation I hear about present times. So, climate. One person says, I'm in my late 20s, and in the last couple of years, I realized I want kids. But with the increased effect of global warming, I'm starting to feel like having a kid would just be selfish. The pandemic. One person says, hope for humanity equals decimated, completely ruined. I used to think I wanted kids. I'm not bringing kids into this world. Presumably, they're thinking about the weaknesses in the response to the pandemic. The economy, one person says, I'm just pessimistic about the situation. I dream of having my own home one day, somewhere I can start my own family, but it just seems so far out of reach for ordinary people these days. And then finally, about division. I and many of my friends have cut ties with people we'd considered friends just over political beliefs. This is something that is starting to dramatically occur, especially within my generation, Gen Z, toward older generations. So, not to put us all in a bad mood, but again, I think this is the spirit. These are not uncommon things to hear when I talk to individuals, really anywhere, but particularly my age, I'm 40 or younger, when thinking about the future and whether or not we're on a good trajectory or a bad one nationally. So that's a little bit of context, a little bit of groundwork for why I was thinking about this topic of hope, the need for hope. And from there, I said to myself, well, which theologians, which mystics do I feel that resonate with me, that have the most to say about hope? And my mind immediately went to Julian and Teilhard. So what we're going to do this evening is look to both of them and consider, what does theology have to offer us in a time like this? So beginning with Julian and her famous quote, all shall be well. Who was Julian? She lived during the 14th century. So from around 1343 to 1416, we don't know exactly. The image there is an image of individuals who have died of the plague. More on this in a moment. In fact, we don't even know her name necessarily. It's possible Julian was her given name. but it's likely derived from St. Julian's Church, where she lived as an anchoress. Okay, so a good question to ask is, what's an anchoress? An anchoress or an anchorite is a person who was withdrawn from the world to live a contemplative life in a cell, like a living space, called an anchor hold. And so there's an image of someone entering a consecrated life in the anchor hold. I should pause just a moment to make a note about this. There's two ways to look at the life of an anchoress. And one of my students might say to me, this is a terrible thing to wall somebody up in this way. It demonstrates a medieval world that is threatened by women's spirituality, so threatened that it has to be walled up or walled away. And that is one way of looking at things, and I think worthy of reflection. But I would say this also, that if you skew wholly to that point of view, you lose a sense of Julian's own agency to choose her own way of life. And so, to be enclosed as an anchoress, you could think of that as a cell in a prison sense, but perhaps it's more accurate to think of it like a womb, that it's a place, like a birthplace of spiritual insight. The church where she lived has been rebuilt, and it has a shrine there honoring Julian. It's an Anglican church you can visit. It was destroyed most especially by the Blitz, so in World War II. And Julian stands out to us now as an exemplar, and in her own time as well. That part of being an anchoress is you had these a window where you could speak with visitors, so that you could share the wisdom and insight that came from your way of life with others. So again, this kind of giving birth. And Julian famously met with Marjorie Kemp, another woman mystic of the time. So there was this relationship and this sharing in that way, but among the mystics as well. And then finally, we're fortunate enough to have Julian's writing. She gives to us the Revelations of Divine Love. There is a short text, and then years later, she wrote a longer text. This is possibly the first English language work by a woman author. And so this, when referring to her thought in her text, this is the source. Now, her time, I call it the calamitous 14th century, which is kind of a playful reference to a history book that was quite popular for a time. It's titled The Calamitous 14th Century, as a distant mirror, the calamitous 14th century. And why would somebody call it calamitous? Well, it was a time of plague. One person at the time writes, "There's a great death in Norwich. I assure you, it's the most universal death I have ever known in England." It's a time of war. There was the 100 Years' War, and in England also the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, during which Norwich was briefly captured and then recaptured, after which the rebel leaders were executed nearby. If I remember my history correctly, a bishop was responsible for putting down the rebellion in that region. So the portfolio of bishop was larger in that time than perhaps now. And then finally, schism. Okay, so you're living in a world of disorder. There's plague, there's war, there's suffering, but it's the Middle Ages. You're a person of faith. Maybe you turn toward the church and think, well, here I will find a sense of order such that it reflects a divine order. And yet, in the 14th century, there was a schism that produced 2, and at one time even 3 rival popes. So there too, great discord and perhaps anxiety. So this is the time in which Julian is writing, and it's important to remember that this is a person who has suffered and has witnessed suffering. We should reflect on that and take that very seriously as we consider what she has to say. In the Revelations of Divine Love, she writes toward the beginning that she was 30 and a half years old when she became quite ill. God sent her a bodily sickness. And she was so sick that she was bedridden, and they had a priest come to her to give her last rites. And he set up a crucifix so that she could gaze at the crucifix and meditate on it. And it was at this time where she was approaching what she thought was her death, that she received these visions, these revelations, these showings. She says, "It was he himself who showed me this without any intermediary." And when we talk of showing, I mean, some of it seems to have been literal, like a literal vision, for instance, initially of the crucifix bleeding. And then other aspects of the showing or the revelation are what was revealed in her mind or in her heart. So over time, spiritual insight. We have the benefit from her book of reading about both. So I'm going to draw out some images and some themes just to give us a sense of Julian. First, famously, the hazelnut. She writes, "In this vision, he showed a little thing the size of a hazelnut in the palm of my hand, and it was round as a ball. I looked at it with my mind's eye and thought, what can this be? And then she's answered, it is all that is made. And then she says, I wondered how it could last, for it was so small, I thought it might suddenly have disappeared. And then she's told, it lasts and will last forever because God loves it. And so you see there my citation from the long text, chapter 5. So first, what's striking about this is the immensity, perhaps even we should say the cosmic proportions of the vision. That the hazelnut she's witness to is all that is made, all created things. And indeed also the fragility of what she is witnessing, that there's a fragility to all that is made such that it might disappear. How could it last? And yet she is reassured that it's God's love, which is sustaining all created things. Now remember this when we're talking about Teilhard, because there's resonance here. The second theme is this idea of God in all things. She writes, everything which is appropriately done is of God's doing. For it is easy to understand that the best deed is well done, and the lowest deed is done as well as the best, and the highest. All are done appropriately and in the order that our Lord has ordained since before time began. For there is no doer but he. And she also says, or rather God says, see that I am God. See that I am in everything. See that I do everything. See that I have never stopped ordering my works, nor ever shall eternally. Now, remember what I said earlier about disorder, that if you look in the world around you, you perceive all of this perhaps chaos or disorder, even in God's own church. And yet she is reassured that God is there. God is bound up with us. When I talked about the hazelnut, I said it had cosmic proportions, and yet at the same time, there's this immediacy, this intimacy of God with us, God with our actions, and God with our very being. In the Quran, it says that God is closer than our jugular vein. I think Julian would agree with this. And here we have an image of the soul. So remember, God's with us. She says, and then our Lord opened my spiritual eyes and showed me my soul in the middle of my heart. And I saw the soul as large as if it were an endless world and as if it were a holy kingdom. And from the properties I saw in it, I understood that it is a glorious city. In the center of that city sits our Lord Jesus. The Holy Trinity rejoices eternally over the way man's soul is made. So first, I am fascinated by the way she thinks of space and spatiality, that the cosmic becomes the hazelnut, and the intimacy and the immediacy of God in our heart is in fact an entire city. But also here we see another image of the closeness of the divine, and another way of saying that it's okay to be human, that our lives and our existence is bound up with God and God's will and God's work and God's love. And so this is the way that Julian sees the world, even in a world where there is so much suffering that she herself has experienced. And that brings us also to one of her longer passages, which is a parable of the Lord and the servant. She writes, "The servant does not just walk, but leaps forward and runs in great haste." Okay, so this is about sin. You might be thinking, with everything I said about love and the immediacy of God and this kind of inner beauty, you might be asking, well, what about sin and sinfulness? So Julian imagines, remember, it's the Middle Ages. She imagines a feudal lord, like a king or a prince, who has a servant. And he says to the servant, here is a message, go be my messenger and deliver this to where I need it to go. And so the servant is eager to do this. The servant loves his Lord. He wants to obey his Lord. And so Julian writes, the servant does not just walk, but leaps forward and runs in great haste, in loving anxiety to do his Lord's will. And then he falls. He falls immediately into a slough and is very badly hurt. And so what then? What does the Lord think of this? She writes, and this is how his loving Lord tenderly continued to consider him. Outwardly, he regarded him gently and kindly, with great sorrow and pity. You see, it's the Lord is not angry. He's not mad. This is not wrath. This is not God's wrath. It's God's mercy. This kind Lord said within himself, look at my beloved servant. What injury and distress he has received in my service for love of me. Is it not reasonable that I should compensate him for his terror and his dread, his hurt and his injury, and all of his misery? So the parable is not saying that we will never fall. It's not saying that we will never know hurt and fear and suffering. What it is saying is that even in the midst of all that, even if we think poorly of ourselves and our mistakes, that God will still look on us kindly. And that God is there with us, maybe most especially with us in moments such as that. And it's often said of Julian that, because of her medieval context, that you have to think of this in the sense of, again, the prince and the servant, the feudalism, that there's a certain way that the prince should treat the prince's subjects, that there's a kind of chivalry to it, that there are certain obligations a servant might have to their lord, but the Lord also has obligations. There's a right way of being the prince. And it's a way of care and concern and responsibility for those that serve you, that you will keep them, that you will care for them, but that you will keep them well. And so this brings us to love. I often say that if you're thinking about mysticism and you're thinking about transformation or journey as key themes, you're doing a good job. Keep going. And if you're thinking of mysticism and you're thinking about love, well, then you're exactly right. Julian writes, I saw that for us, he is everything that we find good and comforting. He, God, is our clothing, wrapping us for love, embracing and closing us for tender love, so that he can never leave us, being himself everything that is good for us, as I understand it. And then toward the end of her writing, she has a doubt about her visions. And she receives this: who showed you this? Love. What did he show? Love. Why did he show it to you? For love. And this is how I was taught that our Lord's meaning was love. Love that we might be sustained, even in our woundedness. Love, as she famously said, such that all things, all manner of thing, shall be well. Okay. Now we'll turn to Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. The future is more beautiful than all the pasts. Teilhard was very future oriented, as we shall discover. Who was Teilhard? I will answer this only very briefly. First, we could say he's a soldier, was a soldier. He was born in France in 1881, and thus he served in World War I as a stretcher bearer. So in the trenches, even though he was already a priest, he served carrying a stretcher. Now, imagine the anxiety, the fear, the absolute terror of all that, and what he must have seen. Courage and bravery and companionship, but also an incredible amount of pain and death. And so I often say this of Teilhard, that one of the critiques that is laid against him is that he's too optimistic. That for him to have lived in the age he lived and saw what modernity had wrought, on the battlefield especially, that it's just a naive optimism for him to have faith in the future. This is the charge that is sometimes leveled. And it's perhaps not a new charge. All mystics, I think, are sometimes accused of thinking too well of humanity. But to that, I would answer this: that when talking of Julian, a woman who lived through plague and war and all kinds of hardship, and when you're talking of Teilhard, a person who literally served in the trenches of World War I, and they tell you that things are going to be okay, that you have to take that seriously. And so that's worth reflecting. He was also a scientist. He made considerable contributions as a geologist and a paleontologist, and his theology is notable for its incorporation of evolutionary theory. So again, he has this, I talked about him being forward-looking, but he's also past-looking. Teilhard has a way of seeing through and in cosmic time because of his scientific training. And we'll speak more about this. But it's helpful to think of what lenses did he use to look at the world around him and to think theologically. Perhaps most importantly, he was a priest. He was a Jesuit priest, deeply influenced by Christian mysticism, which he had first learned reading about mystic saints at the knees of his mother. Now, perhaps the calamitous 20th century needs no introduction, but I'll make just a few points. The first is World War. As one person observed, the lamps are going out all over Europe, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime. Totalitarianism, so fascists, dictators, tyrants, and I would say the real fear that this might become the dominant form of government on the planet, that was a live question. And then finally, the threat of annihilation. So the idea at a species level of an existential threat, either because of total war, genocide, or atomic weaponry. As we did with Julian, I will draw some themes from Teilhard. The first is seeing. He writes at the beginning of his monograph, The Human Phenomenon, seeing. One could say the whole of life is this, if not ultimately, at least essentially. And then in the Divine Milieu, he writes, I have already accustomed myself to seeing, beneath the stillness of that piece of bread, a devouring power, which, in the words of the greatest doctors of your church, far from being consumed by me, consumes me. And so there's this capacity with Teilhard to see, to perceive what others might not be able to. That's kind of in my thinking, the genius of Teilhard as a mystic is his capacity for taking his scientific training and using it to produce a new kind of seeing and then translate that to us. And again, like Julian, it has this cosmic immensity as well, because he's able to think in terms of evolutionary time from the beginnings of the universe through the evolution of humanity. And so with this, again, this idea of God in all things, he writes, God in all that is most living and incarnate in him is not far away from us. Altogether apart from the world we see, touch, hear, smell, and taste about us. Rather, he awaits us every instant in our action, in the work of the moment. There is a sense in which he is at the tip of my pen, my spade, my brush, my needle, of my heart, and of my thought. It is not unlike Julian's City of the Soul. It's not unlike Julian's insight that God is in all things and that God is the ultimate doer, the ultimate source of action. Teilhard too has this realization that our actions as we work to build the world are bound up with the divine. And it becomes a matter of perceiving that reality. It becomes a question of seeing. How might we best see this reality that already exists? And for Teilhard, this idea of God in all things is moving toward the future. He says in The Human Phenomenon, the way out for the world, the gates of the future, the entry into the superhuman, will not open ahead to some privileged few or to a single people, elect among all peoples. These gates, they will yield only to the thrust of all together. And so what's key here is that, first off, this could be read as profoundly inclusive, as profoundly anti-racist, because it's saying to us that the future is for us a single people all together, and that there can be no room for divisions with this. The future is for us all together. So, this idea of the privileged few, I think it's an important observation from Teilhard, that we have to find, or perhaps uncover, the reality that there is much more that binds us than divides. And indeed, there is a purpose in what we do, and there is a future for us, a future for all of us. And so this brings us once again to love, this idea of the binding together. Teilhard writes that considered in its full biological reality, love, the affinity of being with being, is not peculiar to man. It is a general property of all life, and as such it embraces, in its varieties and degrees, all the forms successively adopted by organized matter. So I will offer a brief explanation of Teilhard. What is he saying here? He is saying that love is a divine force in all things, that the same energy that attracts two people to each other as friends or companions, this is the same energy that draws atoms together to form molecules. That the story of creation ongoing is a story of this love energy drawing things forward, drawing things together and forward, binding atoms such that they produce planets, a kind of geogenesis of planetary formation. And then upon at least one of those planets, if not many others, a biogenesis, such that vegetation and animals come to surround the globe. And then from there, a kind of psychogenesis, or the advent, the coming of thought. And perhaps even onto consciousness, particularly human consciousness is what we experience, that we have self-reflective consciousness, such that we can now perceive this evolutionary process and also perceive our own role in that journey. You know, perceive how we can build the future together. And this may be moving towards something that he called a noogenesis. He refers to the noosphere, which is his understanding that the human self-reflective consciousness may evolve yet still further into a global consciousness. And what is it that's driving all this, drawing all of this forward? It's love. You know, for Teilhard, what this is moving toward is Christ, what he calls the omega point. And so again, if you think back to Julian, this idea that God is with us even when we stumble, that God is with us in our actions, in our sense of purpose. Remember the messenger. Now, I'm going to make just a few comments to draw connections, but I hope you've noted some of your own. The first I will comment on is seeing, and I'll say this, that some of you may have had the experience where you have a friend, a loved one, a family member, and they're having a difficult time. And maybe they are saying, you know, bad things about themselves, right? You know, I've made mistakes, I'm a terrible person, and on, worse than that. And it's hard to hear, isn't it, when somebody's saying that about themselves and you care about them? It's hard to hear them talk that way. And you might think, you might even say, if you could see yourself the way that I see you, you would not say these terrible things, because you would see all that is valuable about you. And you would know that this moment of depression it's ultimately a lie, because you would see as I see, and you would see the truth. And so for me, part of both Julian and Teilhard, in different ways, is to see that truth, because they're seeing all of humanity, the individual and the whole, in the way that, or at least they're imagining, at least the way that God sees. You know, what would it mean for us spiritually, or in terms of our motivations, our drives, our actions, our thoughts? What would it mean if we could see ourselves the way that God sees us? Seeing for Teilhard and Julian, it's God in all things, but it's God also embracing the cosmos, like the hazelnut. God in ourselves as God sees us. And for both of them, it's a matter of scale and scope. You know, the hazelnut, to have all the cosmos in your hand. Teilhard, to imagine the entire history of the universe as this divine unfolding. For Julian to think of the immediacy and intimacy of God as the Lord looking upon the wounded servant. And for Teilhard to think of that same immediacy in the Eucharist, or even bound up with the energy that holds our atoms together at the microscopic level. With them both, I see a sense of human purpose, that we are building the world together, that God is with us, and with us especially when we stumble. This sense of togetherness, I think, is important. And if you draw on the seeing, if you draw on the idea of scale, imagine it this way. At the beginning, I talked about division, that our society seems to have all these terrible divisions, maybe now worse than ever, some would say. And if you look at the level of your own family, you may see division. And if you look at the level of your town or your city or a school board meeting, you may see terrible division. And if you look at the level of the nation, you may see division. But Teilhard and Julian both are calling on us to at least imagine for a moment, what if we looked from a further vantage point still? What if we could draw back further than family, than city, than nation, to globe or universe or all created things? And what if you could see all of humanity from there? Would you still see division, or would it seem as if we are all one purpose, one unity, one perhaps love? Would it look differently then? And I think this, again, is an important mystic insight that you see in numerous mystical theologians, that this idea of division and separation, it's an illusion, that the unity is more powerful still because love is more powerful still. And so that's the third theme. In building the world, we are also developing our own selves. Why? As reflections and extensions of that divine love. So in terms of hope, I do think it is possible to look at both Julian and Teilhard and come away with this message that who we are matters, that what we do matters, and that we are loved, and all shall be well. Now, my hope is that maybe you're interested, you want to read some more about Julian and Teilhard. So I wanted to provide just a few references for further reading. I could come up with many more, and I'm sure Kathy and others could as well. But the Revelations of Divine Love is extraordinary, the most powerful of books. I strongly recommend it to anyone who hasn't read it. And if you have, read it again. There are many editions. There's a Penguin edition, which I quite like. Oxford Classics has an edition. And the Classics of Western Spirituality, which is an amazing series as a whole, they have an edition as well, which I think the title is Showings for theirs. I think so. If you want to read more about Julian, there's an excellent book called Julian of Norwich, Theologian, from Dennis Turner at Yale. And then if you want to watch a documentary that I found quite interesting, it's free on YouTube. It's called BBC, The Search for the Lost Manuscript, Julian of Norwich. So if you search that, it will come up for you, and you can watch the whole hour-long documentary. It's about the tracing of her manuscripts, kind of the provenance of them, and how they came to be rediscovered, essentially. If I recall correctly, part of that story is that women religious preserved her manuscripts when they fled the English Reformation to the continent. So fascinating. With Teilhard, I recommend The Divine Milieu as an introduction to his spiritual thinking. And then Spirit of Fire from Ursula King which is a biography, but she talks quite a bit about his thought as well. Oh, yes. Recently, I read just one more book to mention, The Book of Hope by Jane Goodall and Douglas Abrams. So in this book, they start with the same premise we did, that we're in a time that needs signs of hope. And Jane Goodall describes what gives her hope, including the resilience of nature, the activities of youth who are trying to volunteer and make the world a better place. Jane Goodall has read Teilhard, and she cites him at different times. So she is a Teilhardian too. If you'd like to read a book review, I wrote one in the last issue of Teilhard Perspective, the newsletter for the Teilhard Association. All right, I know we have some time set aside for conversation. I just wanted to give you a few prompts, some ideas for what you might talk about, some questions. You need not talk just about this. I just wanted to help you. The first is maybe hope. Where do you see signs of hope in the current moment? Or perhaps going back to our goals, connection. Do you see connections between Julian and Teilhard? Do you see differences? Resonance. Is there an insight from Julian or Teilhard that particularly resonates with you? And then finally, witness. What can we do to carry the message of hope forward in the world? So I hope that those are helpful. And with that, I thank you once again for listening. It's been a pleasure.
So thank you very much, Josh, for that beautiful, very beautiful presentation. The lovely images that went with it, and the depth of your presentation. It was very moving to me, and I hope to others also.
Our
Wonderful.
first question, Josh, is who would you name as a modern day mystic in the form of Julian and Teilhard?
What a terrific question that I don't know the answer to. I mean, in some ways, I think there are many, right? I mean, I feel I've sometimes said that Teilhard is a mystic in the way of all Jesuits, and so I feel that I'll give some answer, and then maybe somebody can help me give even more answer. But what I would say first off is following on Bernard McGinn, who is the great, perhaps like the greatest living scholar of mysticism, Christian mysticism. I would say that mysticism is for everyone. So there is nothing, mysticism is, it's described in different ways, but to me, it's just a particular commitment to a relationship with God, and a particular commitment to Christian spirituality that is not, inaccessible. And so there may be something for all of us in mysticism. And so if I can get away with being cute, I might say maybe it's you. But I don't, if Andrew or Kathy, if you want to name some names.
Josh, that's an awesome answer. I would just affirm what you said in terms of we're all mystics on some level, and it's just learning how to cultivate that, how to express it. But we've got some great responses in the chat, actually. Seraphim Winslow dropping some heavy hitters to start with. Terrence McKenna, for one, who I'm a huge fan of. And he was familiar with Teilhard too in his philosophy. But Thomas Berry, Brian Swim, Bernadette Roberts, Rudolf Steiner, Daniel Andreev. So really extending beyond just even the Christian tradition in a sense, which is interesting to include some modern day thinkers, writers, people who read the signs of the times and cultivate hope. Here's another one from Josh.
Yeah, I have an interest in Islam, and Omid Safi is he studies Islamic mysticism, has wonderful podcasts on this topic. Recommend him highly.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like independent media voices that have risen too, with podcasts that have given voice to people who are doing interesting things in the world and that maybe aren't getting recognized, with traditional media and things like that, that have charitable organizations that are doing really neat work, addressing issues that are getting underplayed on the bigger stage. So yeah, it's kind of like, I think, think about what you're into and what you can really nerd out about and go down, those roads. And you can probably think of people within that field. Jane Goodall, for example, you're talking about earlier, people like that. So, but let's get another question up here in the chat from our audience and see if it's easier maybe for some folks. I guess we could go with the raising of a hand. You want to use the raise hand function? I'll do my best to see who has their hand up. So Josh, I know it was interesting for me to get into Julian and her background. Admittedly, having studied Christian spirituality myself, she was one who I probably read a little bit of, her writing, but didn't get too much in her biography. So it's interesting to have that in the same way that in studying Teilhard, we learn why he was able to cultivate such a sense of hope and promise in the future, despite having lived through such a dark and trying time. Pope Francis, here's another one. Yes, definitely a person who embodies that spirit of hope. Here we go. Question: do you think that all will be well, saying traditionally attributed to Julian, is apocalyptic?
Well, it depends on what we mean by apocalyptic. I think that it means that there's. I think it aligns. There's a moment where Julian says that her revelations and everything, her insight, aligns fully with the teachings of Holy Church, I think is how she phrases it. But what I would say is that part of her hope and part of her vision is sort of the Christian promise of the kingdom of heaven. So in some ways, for all to be well, maybe this is a cumulative effect, right? That this will come in the fullness of time after, what we might call apocalypse, the judgment, the, sort of the next stage of existence. Some have asked the question, is Julian of Norwich a universalist? Meaning that, does she believe that no one, hell is empty, that everyone is somehow saved? I think all mystics have struggled with this because, there's this tension between God's wrath and God's mercy in any theological thinking. And mysticism has a tendency to put all of the energy toward God's mercy. And so it becomes very difficult indeed to think, how can there be a hell at all? I have no, I don't know if there's a final answer on this question, but what I can say is that in Julian's way of seeing, what she saw was mercy and love.
And we have a question in here too about that love, in terms of, would you speak about love as the energizing force of the universe?
Yeah, well, I think in the Teilhardian sense, again, there's this idea that for Teilhard, the definition of love includes the energy that holds atoms together. And it also includes, I was talking with Kathy earlier about this Teilhardian notion of the zest for life. So this desire to lean in and to find ways to unite with other people, to exercise our unique gifts, because we're being called to build up the earth as well. That's part of what it means to be human, is to discover these capacities and employ them as best we may. And for Teilhard, the drive there, it's a drive, but also a pulling forward, which is love. That is, it's God's love that sustains all this and draws it toward, again, something in some ways apocalyptic, an omega point, another sort of stage. So I hope that helps some, but Teilhard is famously complex, and I would encourage reading more Teilhard, because I always learn something new.
Josh, this is a question that came out of my small group I was in, but it was in regard to suffering and how Teilhard remained hopeful, how Julian remained hopeful, despite the suffering in their own lives, the suffering they witnessed, and moreover, the suffering that exists outside in the world, both in their times, but also in the world today, specifically in the world today.
I'm sorry, Andrew, the question, how
Oh,
were
so
they
in terms of that being a question, how did they cultivate hope despite that suffering?
I think, I think with difficulty at times, with challenging, that, but I think also that it goes back to this question of seeing that if things, well, I'll say two things. First, there's a sense of movement and purpose and activity. And it brings to mind the quote that's attributed to Churchill sometimes, that if you're going through hell, keep going. And so there's this activity, but there's also the seeing that if things look bleak and you're despondent and you find yourself in despair, is there a way that you could adjust your way of perceiving, your way of seeing, to maybe reframe or to look at things differently? And so this was what I was talking about with this idea of scaling further and further back, to look at humanity from different vantage points and consider maybe there's a way to reconceptualize so it doesn't seem as bad as it does in this one present moment, in the fullness of time, or in the fullness of this kind of mystical spatiality that they're able to engage. Maybe in that context or through that lens, things might seem different, and you can find this kind of spark for hope. You can find this way of re-energizing your own sense of purpose so that you too can keep going.
Beautifully said, Josh.
Yeah.
Hopefully that speaks to the conversation that unfortunately we couldn't get too deeply into in the group discussion because of the time constraints. However, Claire has had her hand up. So let's go to Claire Rusowitz.
Thank you. I guess when I was thinking about when you were sort of comparing these calamitous times, which, is a hard thing to do. How do you compare calamities? But I keep feeling in this day and age that climate change is something very different, in a very different category. And Teilhard was a scientist. He was a mystical scientist. And I was thinking a lot about it tonight, wonder how his, if he was alive today, how his experience and seeing climate change, his understanding as a scientist, because this isn't, we're not looking at something and said, oh, this might be the end of the world. This might be, we're in pretty bad shape, in the language of the sixth extinction coming. So just any thought about if the global climate change could even be a tipping point for someone like Teilhard, but precisely because he's also a scientist, so just any thought on that? I mean, I know there's no real answer to this, but just your thought, anything.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great question. And I think you are right that, that there is something that feels different about this existential threat to the future of the planet, the future of humanity. I don't know what Teilhard might have said. I think I can think of a variety of responses. But I would say that climate change presenting as an existential threat will have a way of asserting itself. I know that now there are those who debate it and push back against the reality of the situation we find ourselves in, but ultimately it will assert itself. And what I would hope is that more and more individuals will come together, bring their energy together in the face of this existential threat to find a way toward change and a way toward the future. And that may be possible, yet still. And Jane Goodall, for instance, talks about the resiliency of nature. And so maybe there's a way forward yet. Just one more comment about Teilhard is in a letter he wrote, he's reflecting on the H-bomb that was developed toward the end of his life. And he says that it is very sad, it is a real shame that all of these brilliant minds, all of these scientists put their thinking together for warfare. What would it mean if they could take all of this energy and this potential and put it toward love, put it toward a future, toward, in this case, survival? And so I think he would see climate change as just the kind of challenge that could bring people together, and sort of bring humanity a leap forward. I think that's the kind of optimism he would hold. So, that's just some of my thoughts on that, but I think it's an excellent question.
Thank you, Josh. Let's go to the Frosts, Frank and Mary.
Okay, it's only Frank who's going to ask this question, I think. Josh, I want to start off by saying you did a wonderful job. Really a pleasure to have you draw the connections between these mystics and the connections of them to the calamitous worlds. My question has to do with the differences between them rather than the similarities, because Teilhard was somebody who was in love with the world, and Julian was somebody who left the world. She went to an anchor hold and stayed out of the world, and he went, and his whole movement was just the opposite direction. Can you reflect on why going those two different directions could end up in the same place?
That's a terrific question. I think they ended up in the same place because it ultimately came from the same place. That the thread of Christian mysticism, extends outward from Christ, so it's no surprise to me that there would be such commonality between the two of them, and that they would wind up with a similar insight. But you raise a really good point about their different ways of life. One in an anchor hold, and the other, Teilhard was famously a world traveler. He's kind of an Indiana Jones theologian, and I think the insight I would derive from that is that if God is in all things, then wherever you go, there God is. You need not be a world traveler. Indeed, you can be a different kind of world traveler within an anchor hold. So that might be one insight I would draw out of it. And then also that, we all find ourselves with different opportunities and different gifts and different ways of life in front of us. And part of the beauty of this is that those different contexts and those different lenses can help us to see and translate certain insight in fresh ways. So that speaks to their different ways of life and speaks to their different historical contexts, the science of the 20th century and so forth. I could say more, but I think that's what a great question.
Josh, thank you for your responses that are just taking us deeper beyond your presentation now. This is great. Someone comments here, there are external journeys and internal journeys. Both went on internal journeys. I think external journeys can certainly be catalysts for internal journeys, but ultimately the depth and exploration of self is bottomless, because the depth and exploration of God is bottomless. It's infinite. So, that says something about inspiring hope too, perhaps in some way. But just to touch on some other comments and really some questions I'm trying to go back to here that see some people brought up in the chat. Someone, Eric Frankhauser, asked the question wasn't it Jesus Christ that said, "All will be well" to Julian? If so, was she's seen the big picture as you described earlier.
Mhm. So yeah, I mean that right. It was sort of in the study of Islam. In Islam, we talk about God's speech in the Quran. It was like this. It was God's speech. But what's the question, Andrew?
So was it Jesus that said that?
Mhm. I believe so. Yes.
Okay, so in a way, that quote is attributable then to Jesus.
That's right.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like a red letter Bible. You could do a red letter Julian, and you see some of the revelation is God's direct speech. And I think I highlighted some of that in the presentation, but it's true of all shall be well. That she's reassured that she has these anxieties, and she has questions and she has anxieties, and God provides answers to her in time. And that's what's so fascinating about her, is like when you think of revelation or showing, there's many different kinds of revelations, many different kinds of showings that she experiences. Some of it insight, some of it direct visual presentation, either like in the room with her or in her mind. And if you read it very closely, you can see she too makes these distinctions, and it's fascinating. I held myself back from discussing it in the presentation because I would have talked for 30 minutes just about this, which I find so very interesting.
Thanks for, like I said, Josh, kind of taking us beyond now and opening things up a little bit. Someone asked a question here. Sister Dorothy says, would you say that Teilhard and Julian saw the world in sacramental time?
Yes. I mean, I think that's part of, Teilhard had this vision of the entire sort of cosmos as Eucharist, that, both of them have a way of thinking in sacramental terms, whether it's time or again, space. But it brings to mind some of these key themes, this idea of God in everything, this idea of a kind of transformation or transubstantiation of all things. And that if you see the world and experience the world in this way, then once again, it means that there's something very special about us as well.
I'm trying to go here to a question I saw earlier where it said something about prayer, and says, oh, here it is, from Donald Rogers, asks, is mysticism, you're talking about seeing things in terms of sacramental time, is mysticism always associated with prayer?
I would say that it's always associated with, this goes for both the Christian and Islamic traditions that I'm most familiar with, that it's always associated with a kind of closeness with God, and a yearning for the divine, from the heart. And oftentimes it seems perhaps almost exclusively, if not exclusively, that yearning leads toward prayer. And maybe the yearning itself is prayer, even if you're not giving it some traditional form. But there's a line, I think, in Rumi that talks about being human is like being a reed that's calling out, like a flute, that's calling out for to once again be joined with God. That there's this sort of this longing, this desire, sometimes described even erotically, but this desire for the divine. And you see this in Julian as well. There was some passage that made me think of Rumi for just that reason.
Very nice. Thank you. Yeah, that's certainly helpful in terms of seeing it beyond just the Christian tradition as well. I think is helpful when we're reading Teilhard, because I've found that individuals are drawn to Teilhard that come from areas that you wouldn't find traditional Christian mind or background perhaps. So it's interesting, and it's a testament to him and to his vision. We even have a comment here I thought it was interesting, from Sarah from Winslow, who says, according to Eastern Orthodox tradition, hell was emptied on Holy Saturday. Christ harrowed hell. So it's speaking to that perhaps more perpetual consciousness of that presence of God with us, as explored through that tradition. Yeah, and I know that Teilhard himself was partial to the Eastern Fathers and the way they saw God's presence and God's hand unfolding within creation.
Yeah.
So, he himself was not limited in his own influence in that too. Think about his influence in the war, his travels, his friendships that extended all beyond not just his nationality, but his faith tradition, his culture. He was a very Renaissance person in that way, and attributed hopefully to this vision of hope, where he was able to see it in not just his own country or corner of the world, but I would assume no matter where he went.
Yeah, he had an incredibly curious mind, right? I mean, he read voraciously and traveled all over. As far as I can tell from his biography, he had a great love of meeting all different kinds of people, conversation. There's this, I don't know, I want to say fiery. Everything with Teilhard is fiery, but this intellectual curiosity with Teilhard, and maybe that's part of hope too, is to find, hope to me seems linked very closely with creativity, but also with curiosity, that you maintain your intellectual and maybe even spiritual or emotional curiosity about the world around you, that you keep trying to see, you keep changing perspective, and that keeps you moving forward. And there's something there for all of us, in terms of living a good life, a successful life. And I think you see this with Julian as well. She describes herself, I believe, she says, "I'm a simple, unlettered creature," and then goes on to produce one of the most beautiful works of literature in the English language. It's testimony to, I mean, it's humility, but it's also maybe perhaps a way that she was trying to navigate around church officials by, here are the things that I want to say, but I'm going to take a step back from them. That she was very courageous in threading a pathway that allowed her to share her insight with us still today, even though there perhaps was some risk in doing that in the Middle Ages as a woman.
Thank you, Josh, for your time, your insight, your wisdom, your willingness to explore tonight with us with these questions. Really grateful for a wonderful and rich presentation. A lot to think about beyond just this time together.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you all so much. I've greatly enjoyed this, and the questions were challenging, but a great deal of fun, and it's been a true pleasure. I wish you all good things.
So now, Sister Kathy, we'd like to turn it over to you to give some final words and thanks here.
Yes, I do want to thank everyone for coming, and especially thank Josh for a wonderful, wonderful talk. I think we'll be thinking about what you've been saying for quite a while, and I'm glad the conversations in the small groups went well. And thank you to Andrew and Mary and Frank Frost too for the technical help.